Today's program, The New American Dream by Richard Hobbs. And he says this thing about his talk. The new American dream will be all about caring, productive, educational, participatory, and enjoyable activities, not about individual net worth. U.S. economic, political, and social institutions need to be restructured to allow universal access to these human activities. Our individual and institutional values should incorporate democracy, equality, cooperation, kindness, and sustainability. Unlike corporate structures, these values allow personal and social realization. Yesterday I saw Moore's latest movie relative to where to invade next, and I'll tell you, I was pleasantly surprised. I had some expectations, but he went way beyond anything I could hope in an American movie. Richard Hobbs is the executive director of the local human rights nonprofit Human Agenda, the moderator of Move to Amend, and of the Santa Clara County Cooperative Collaborative, and a member of 2 local cooperatives in formation. Please give Richard a big hand and prepare yourself for a fantastic experience.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I figured that somebody would come to open the door, but I didn't expect anybody else. So I really appreciate all of you taking your time to being here to, I hope, what really becomes a conversation, a dialogue. And I look forward to the questions and answers when we get to that part. This morning, as was mentioned, I am going to be talking about the new American dream, or a vision for a better society, and how to get to that vision. Not a small feat at all. But before I begin, I just wanted to mention that I am not a newcomer to the word humanist. In fact, over 30 years ago, in East San Jose, we established an organization called Humanitas. And in 1984, I finished a master's degree at San Jose State called Human Value. And this was a critical analysis of Marx's labor theory of value based upon looking at the totality of our human needs. I also was the director of the Office of Human Relations for Santa Clara County. And I'm currently director of Human Agenda, which was established in 2002. And we describe ourselves as an eco-humanist organization. So trying to basically take into account the needs of the planet and the needs of human beings. I recently spoke to a human rights class at San Jose State University. And I asked the students there, because I figured if they knew something about human rights, what the letters E, S, and C might mean to them. And it was interesting. It was only the professor who knew what E, S, C meant. None of the students could remember from their prior classes. You may know that in 1976, one of the human rights instruments, following the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, was the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ESC, which, of course, the United States never became a signatory to, because while it did sign the other one from that year, the Political and Civil Rights Treaty, with about 50 exceptions and conditions, it never did sign the International Human Rights Treaty on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. That was a thing for third world countries and for the Soviet bloc, but not for the United States of America or really the Western world at that time. So I tried to explain to the class that I had a different ESC that, in my opinion, describes our current system. in the United States of America. Really, when I think of the economy, I think about exploitation. Because honestly, the foundation of our economic system from the get-go under capitalism has been an exploitative system built upon exploiting others for profit. I also explained to them that the S for me really is where our economy has been heading in the last 20 years, and that's speculation. We have become kind of the casino capitalist empire of the world. Finance capital now is where people invest their money, not so much in factories in the United States of America or even factories in third world countries. Money is made by investing more money in derivatives and other financial instruments that can produce money quickly and in great amounts, leading, of course, to the enormous concentration and centralization of capital that Karl Marx talked about 150 years ago. And the C, really, because I have been working for a long time trying to get a 28th Amendment to the Constitution that would overturn Citizens United and say that money is not speech and corporations are not people, is, in my opinion, we're suffering from a huge amount of corruption. Now, the Supreme Court, when they decided 5-4, and Scalia was one of the 5, by the way, when the Supreme Court decided in 2010 to support Citizens United, the majority specifically held that allowing corporations to give unlimited amounts of money anonymously does not have a corrupting influence. The American people don't believe that. 80% of Republicans support overturning Citizens United. 80% of Republicans support it. So I think we pretty much know that we have institutionalized corruption going on in our society today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that ESC, that different ESC, really means on the ground in terms of the trends in the United States. What it means is that of all of the industrialized countries on Earth, the United States has the highest inequality, the lowest taxes, the greatest border inequality, the biggest military budget, the most military bases, the highest incarceration rate, and the most prisons, the most expensive elections. It's anticipated it's going to be $10 billion this year alone. The longest hours of work. We still don't have health care for all. No paid family leave. No employer-required sick leave. No employer-required vacation time. The lowest corporate tax rate and the highest child poverty rate. And a lot of these are actually illustrated in Michael Moore's movie. I do recommend that you see that. Where to Invade Next, where he invades 11 European countries, basically, and Tunisia, and demonstrates that there are best practices on Earth that have nothing to do with this American exceptionalism. It basically overcomes a lot of the trends that I just mentioned that really unfortunately mark the conditions in the United States of America today. So this morning I'm going to talk about 4 things. First, about a vision, and basically what should be included in a vision. And then secondly, how to reach that vision. The how is looking at our values, a plan, and a strategy. And I'd like to start with vision because honestly, when I see our candidates speaking, I believe they have a very limited vision. I will give Bernie Sanders the benefit of the doubt for having a broader vision than the rest of all of the candidates combined. But still, I think a comprehensive vision built upon human needs is not something that has been systematically developed in this country that I have seen to date. And that's what one of the areas that Human Agenda has been working on for a number of years. If we don't know where we're going, that's exactly where we're going to wind up. Confused. We really need a roadmap that can orient our daily actions, but also our communities, our regions, our nation, and even the planet. And the basis of the vision that I'm going to be talking about is a vision based upon meeting our human needs, that is, the human needs of everyone, in the pursuit of a healthier, happier life, and also meeting the needs of the planet, so that we also have a healthy planet. Human Agenda has actually interviewed 70 groups like the group here this morning, and also in different countries, and we've asked two questions. First of all, what are your individual needs as a Robinson Crusoe? If you're that Robinson Crusoe on that island, what does it take for you to survive? So these are very basic human needs. And we have, after interviewing 70 groups and asking those questions, we've come up with a pretty verifiable list that every single group gets within 95% of the time. It's very instructive because it can lead to a basis for understanding what we need as individuals. So there are physiological needs, as you can imagine, including air, food, protection of the organism, a rest activity cycle, etc. And then there are psychological needs. And I can appreciate the American Humanist Association. I have been to a national conference of AHA, for example, and the commitment that the American Humanist Association, I feel, has of trying to provide a sense of purpose in people's lives that is not tied to the supernatural. So we don't need to have a sense of purpose in our lives in order to we don't need the supernatural to have a sense of purpose in our lives. And so when we talk about that person that's on that island, that Robinson Crusoe, and we ask them, what is one thing that you need to survive? Everyone says, we need a sense of purpose. We have to have a reason to live. That may be your kids. It may be something that you really want to do in your life personally. And for some people, it is a belief in God. And we have to understand that people come from that perspective too. In terms of psychological needs, I go back to the love ethic of bell hooks that was built upon actually from Erich Fromm. And that love ethic is an ethic built upon caring, commitment, trust, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. And this love ethic is not just about a love ethic to others. It's not a caring just to others. It's also a love ethic for ourselves as individuals. If we don't start with ourselves first, then we can't really emanate those same values to other people. So that sense of connection and purpose is really significant. So after I asked the question, and Human Agenda has asked the question many times, of what an individual needs to survive, we then ask, what does any community need to survive? And this could really be in any society at any time. It's a group of people living in community, whether it be 2,000 years ago in Rome, or in a tribal village in Africa today, or Silicon Valley. What does it take for any community to reproduce itself? And from that exercise, we've basically come up with 5 different areas that can be clarified. One is care work. This isn't only care about yourself, but it's also caring for and taking care of your family and your immediate community, however you define family and community. So it is important to take care of yourself to meet the needs that we've just talked about, but it's also extremely important to take care of those who take care of you, and that is your family. And when we talk about care work, I think it's really important in terms of a vision for a better society that when we talk about things like food preparation, consumption, taking care of children, taking care of elderly, procreation, maintaining your home, taking care of your immediate environment at home is probably the main focus here. We are not talking about female labor. If you have read Juliet Shor's book, The Second Shift, she explains that the average woman in the United States of America works 19 hours more per week than the average man. And so if we really want to have a vision for a better society, that care work has to be distributed somewhat equally, at least with parity. Perhaps not exactly equal, but more paritous than we certainly are living today in the United States of America. It's one of the reasons that women don't have the same access to paid labor is because of all of their unpaid labor. A second area that's really significant for any vision for what I would call a humanist society, a truly humanist society built upon human needs, is that we all participate in labor to the extent that we're able to. And what that means is that we need to be able to produce necessary goods and services at a living wage with reduced work hours. So one of the important reasons for clarifying what our human needs are is to understand what we should be working on to help meet those needs. We don't really need to be building Trident missiles. We don't really need to be working for a health insurance company. We don't need health insurance companies if we had a different kind of society. There are a number of areas that we do as human beings that are really not a product of the necessity of meeting a human need, but rather a product of meeting the needs of our economic system today, which don't necessarily meet our human needs. So understanding what those needs are and understanding our responsibility to our community and to our society to meet those needs means that we need to work in productive labor, in goods or services, at a living wage is really critical. I mean, right now we're in a wage system, and so I use that terminology, wage. But what it really means is that obviously whatever work that we do and contribute to society, we need to make sure that we're getting enough income, if you will, to meet our basic needs as human beings. And perhaps the critical component of this labor for society is reduced work hours. Because without reduced work hours, we simply do not have the time to become fully human. I always call Silicon Valley the poster child of overwork. And the United States is the poster child of overwork internationally. And so we are in the epicenter of overwork right here in Silicon Valley, where 60 to 70 hours of work is not uncommon on both ends. On the ends of working in high tech, for example, it's not uncommon to get out the most important, fanciest, and significant product on planet Earth and work 60, 70 hours a week for that purpose. And then, of course, if you're a low-wage immigrant, which is the group that I work with on a daily basis, it's not uncommon to work 60 or 70 hours to pay the rent. And so we really live in a very bifurcated Silicon Valley where people do engage in an enormous amount of overwork. The AFL-CIO has been one exception in terms of a labor movement internationally, in terms of the developed world, that has really not put reduced work hours on the agenda. When the French had what they called a productivity dividend, because the productivity of labor was going up, and therefore the possibility existed either to get more money as a worker or reduce work hours, the French chose both. They chose both. And so as many of you know, a lot of the European countries, including Germany, France, the Nordic countries, have work weeks of 35 hours. Human Agenda took a group to Mondragon, the biggest cooperatives on earth. And I remember in the city of Mondragon, this tiny town of maybe 10,000 people in northern Spain, the average single store owner in Mondragon had posted on their doors that they were open 33 hours a week. So they were open basically from 10 to 1, and then from 5 to 8 during the week, and then they were open from like 10 to 1 on Saturday. And that was it. None of this Walmart mentality of 24/7. You know, people know that their time is valuable in order to have a life with their kids, with their family, with their community, to engage in civic engagement, and to do those things that fully make us human. So reduced work hours is really critical. And the French sociologist André Gortz, I think, if you've never read André Gortz, he's the one, I think, that really put this out there some 40 years ago. A third area that's really significant for any vision for a better world is having access to lifelong learning and also to reliable information. So we need to be able to learning human beings throughout our lives with reliable information. And then a fourth area that's really critical for any, in my opinion, humanist society would be autonomous, participatory, informed decision-making pretty much at all levels. And so really this is democracy. But this is not just about democracy when we vote for a presidential candidate. This is democracy in the home. Some homes are run like dictatorships. This is democracy in the community. This is democracy at work, which is Richard Wolff spoke 2 weeks ago here in San Jose. Human Agenda had him as a speaker, and his work is called, his latest book is called Democracy at Work, and it's in support of what he calls worker self-directed enterprises, which is really, in my opinion, modeled after Mondragon, the Mondragon cooperatives. I think that he was disingenuous by not mentioning Mondragon in his book. But it really is important that we have democracy at work, democracy in the community, democracy in the family, democracy internationally. And honestly, you know, when we look at our different institutions, including, of course, our political institutions in particular, we really don't even have the opportunity for democracy today. And the final area, really, for any kind of a society that's built upon meeting people's human needs is making sure that there's enough time for people after they have been engaged in that care work, in that labor for society, in educating themselves constantly, and in being engaged in democracy and actually participating in decision making. People need to have time for themselves. This was at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Self-realization was at the very top. And so by self-realization, I think that Maslow meant that we need discretionary or free time in order to do those things that we have passion for. So unfortunately, we have to meet our human needs, and there are certain things that are more like duties or obligations than passions. And we can try to convert those duties into more meaningful activities, but if we really want to find a time for ourselves to do the things that we really love to do, then we need free time. Time for self-actualization. And the society that would actually be structured this way, that would allow individuals to actually access all of these needs. And I failed to mention that we do an analysis of not only material production, but also services. So we all need access, for example, to healthcare, distribution, transportation, communication, administration, life protection services, maintaining the means of production, teaching, and we also all need a cultural and ideological identity also. All of us identify somehow with some group. So we have to understand that each human being needs these services and needs time to be able to not only receive these services, but to, in some ways, provide those services and include those services in how they operate as an individual human being. I'll talk about that in just a little. So I think we can all understand that in the United States of America today, We do not have the economic institutions, we do not have the political institutions, and we do not have the social institutions that would really allow everyone to have their needs met. And that's the challenge. That's the challenge in our current economy. That's the challenge in our current political system. Now, what do we do? How do we meet that challenge? What can we possibly do to try to meet the human needs of everyone? In Human Agenda, we in the last couple of years, we've really felt the need to put out a set of values. Without values, a lot of times we become very directionless in terms of what kind of institutions we need. So we put out what we call DEX values. Those values are democracy, equality, cooperation, kindness, and sustainability. Once again, democracy, equality, cooperation, kindness, and sustainability. So we ask ourselves the question, and as Move to Amend, I have also asked people, audiences before, do you think the modern multinational corporation is democratic, egalitarian, cooperative, kind, sustainable, and, as the gentleman in the back of the room, no. Everybody pretty much agrees. And so this is the leading institution of our economy doesn't share our values. Now let's talk about Wall Street and our financial institutions, our banks. Are they democratic, egalitarian, cooperative, kind, sustainable? Once again. How about our political institutions? I mean, we're engaged in a huge electoral battle this year, and we have certain political institutions for president, for Congress, for local office. And we have to ask the questions, especially in light of Citizens United, but also in light of many other decisions that have been made in this country, sometimes laws, sometimes decisions of the Supreme Court. Are those political institutions democratic? Are they egalitarian? Are they cooperative? Are they kind? Are they sustainable? And I think that when we go through the major institutions of our society, we can see that we're living a nightmare, honestly. We're living a nightmare. And so the question becomes, what could we actually do to create institutions that meet these values? I want to pause here just around sustainability, because I want to read a quote to you in terms of what that really means. Sustainable means that we need to care for our home, planet Earth. We need to renew and replenish Mother Nature while preventing humans from exploiting, depleting, polluting, and degrading our planet. And this is a quote from Ray Grigg, Balancing the Needs of the Planet and Human Needs. He says, quote, 4 of 9 crucial biophysical systems have been damaged beyond their safe boundaries. The extinction rate, deforestation, the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide, and the flow of nitrogen and phosphorus from fertilizer into the ocean. 4 more are seriously stressed. Freshwater use, ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol pollution, and the introduction of exotic chemicals and modified organisms. The only one under successful control is ozone depletion. So this is a scientist that's basically talking about how our planet is being stressed and is completely stressed out or depleted in terms of some of the basic needs of the planet. So moving right along, I'd like to talk about a plan in terms of how to create institutions that might meet these values. It's not easy. Everybody knows it's complex to try to create institutions that meet the values that we really care about. However, I believe that there's a large number of people in the United States that are working on creating those institutions today. And so I want to talk about, if you haven't read Gar Alpowitz, I recommend this book, What Then Must We Do? In that book, he talks about different forms that are actually existing right now in the United States of America that meet some of these value requirements. So he talks about 4 different areas in terms of, he's focusing strictly on the economy at this point. He talks about evolutionary reconstruction, and with that what he means is we need to take small steps to build institutions like cooperatives. And that's why Human Agenda has gotten into the business of incubating cooperatives in the last year. We think that a cooperative, number one, is democratic because the worker owners make the decisions inside the cooperative. It is egalitarian. The typical difference in income between the lowest paid and the highest paid in Mondragon is 1 to 6. In Silicon Valley, it's 1 to 400. And in a lot of cooperatives, including the Sustainable Economics Law Center in Oakland, which is a group of 11 attorneys, the ratio is 1 to 1. Every single attorney gets exactly the same. And the same with the Arizmendi Bakery cooperatives in the North Bay. Every single worker gets exactly the same. In the cooperatives that we're trying to establish, we have created a differential of 1 to 2 as kind of our outside limit. So we're trying to create an institution like a cooperative that is actually egalitarian, much more than our existing economic institutions. Is it cooperative? By its very nature, it's cooperative. Is it also kind? We believe that when people are making their own decisions, people are a lot nicer to each other than some boss coming in and saying, you're fired today, and you have no control over that. You do have some control, and so naturally people are much nicer to each other in a cooperative than in a workplace where you have no control. And finally, sustainable. Most worker owners will not create practices that are going to do damage to themselves or to their communities, whereas a modern multinational corporation has no qualm whatsoever of doing that. And so we believe that cooperatives do provide an important alternative to our current economic institutions. And this is one of the 4 areas that Garo Parawitz talks about in his book, What Then Must We Do? In addition to evolutionary reconstruction like cooperatives, and you should know that there are 130 million people right now that have money in credit unions, which is it's a consumer cooperative of sort. And so there are examples of cooperation going on in our society. The second is what he calls an emerging checkerboard. And what he means by that is that there are municipalities and states that are trying to protect the commons and expand the commons for the common good, for the public good. Examples of that would be the water board here locally. It's publicly owned. There are other public municipal institutions. There are state institutions. There are preserves that are trying to be retained throughout the state of California. There are national parks. Those are part of the commons. They belong to we the people, as opposed to they the corporation. A third area is what he calls crisis transformation. That when there is a crisis, for example, in 2010, when Obamacare was passed and there was the opportunity to actually make healthcare Medicare for all, basically. Now, Obama didn't bite and never allowed the public option for healthcare, but we do know that when there is an opportunity and there is a crisis in a major human need or institution, that the opportunity exists to try to fill that void with a public or socialized option. And healthcare is an example. Pretty much every advanced country on planet Earth has socialized medicine except the United States of America. I work with low-income immigrants. We have 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States that have absolutely zero access to healthcare in the United States of America. That's just one example. So when there is a crisis, then take advantage of the crisis and try to put in its place institutions that really are designed to meet the needs of everyone and not a small group through a profit-making institution like healthcare is run today. And finally, he talks about big crisis transformation. I don't know if you remember, in 2008, we, the people, quote unquote, actually socialized General Motors. We nationalized General Motors. So in 2008, we're in the middle of this huge financial crisis, and one of the, for a period of time, it was denationalized later, but for a period of time, it was a program of the United States of America to actually nationalize General Motors and also AIG. They were subsequently denationalized, but it just shows that in the moment of crisis, and I guarantee there's going to be many crises within our lifetimes and beyond, in those transformational crises, when we have a big crisis, we need to push for options that really provide for the people. Another example, I don't know if everyone is familiar with, I think it's the Bank of North Dakota, I believe, or South Dakota. It was 1911. It's a public state bank. It's North Dakota, thank you. I always get my North and South Dakotas mixed up. And that bank has provided tens of millions of dollars every year to help fund human needs in that state. And so that's another example where you don't need a private bank. We can also have public banks that can serve the needs of the people. So the purpose of talking about these institutions that are brought up in Gar Arpelowicz's book is to let us rethink that there really are institutions that share our values that actually can be created. However, I would say the biggest dilemma and the hardest task that we have as human beings is actually creating those institutions. Believe me, we've been trying to create 2 cooperatives in Human Agenda for the last year, and it has been an enormous amount of work to get those 2 functioning. One is a legal cooperative, and the other one is transforming lawns into gardens with California sustainable plants, drought-resistant plants. And there is a brochure over there. If you'd like to take one, it's called the Smart Yards Cooperative. And so we're trying to ask people to save water, to save money, save maintenance, save time. They can save all of those things if they just convert their green lawns into beautiful California native plants instead, that sometimes require almost no water. So these are examples of what we're trying to do. There are hundreds of cooperatives throughout the United States. The U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives has a list if you go to their website. One group that went to us to Mondragon, and also we took a group of people to see cooperatives in Cuba about a year ago. One group was the Isthmus Engineering in Madison, Wisconsin. They do $40 million of business a year, and they basically engineer new products on a daily basis. So there are larger cooperatives and smaller cooperatives, but there are no multinational cooperatives that I'm familiar with that do business like a Toyota, for example. So the importance of creating alternatives is I think, clear to everyone. We really can't continue to live under these institutions that are oppressing everyone. In terms of oppression, I'd like to just speak very briefly about oppression and alienation. Because when you really look at the full panoply of human needs and understand that there are lots of people that are not getting their basic human needs met, then you can understand in a deeper way the concept, I think, of alienation. Every time that you're alienated from meeting that need, you are, in my opinion, oppressed. And we have institutions throughout this country that are oppressing people on a daily basis. They're not able to meet their basic human needs. The importance of trying to create a more cooperative society was pointed out by Professor Yochai Benkler of Harvard in his book, The Penguin and the Leviathan. In that book, he says that we should take into account the fact that people are genetically predisposed to unconditional cooperation in the United States. About 30% of the people in the United States are predisposed to unconditional cooperation. About 20% are predisposed to conditional cooperation, quid pro quo, I need something to cooperate back. And according to his research, about 1/3 more are primarily interested in what's in it for me, self-interest. And he ends his book, I think, on a very positive note. He says that we need to create cooperative institutions. The only way that human nature is transformed, if we're talking about transforming that 1/3 plus that cares mostly about self-interest, is to create cooperative institutions so that their human nature becomes transformed over time. And I personally have actually seen this in Mondragon, because Mondragon has existed since 1956. And so now we have 3 generations in Mondragon, Spain. And in small cities in northern Spain where people are like the 3rd generation of living in cooperative families, I really sense a transformation in human nature among those people. I also sense it in Cuba, because their cooperatives have existed also from the time of the revolution, and a lot of people, in my opinion, are really interested in promoting the good of their neighbors, of their cooperative, of their society, of their community. So I do speak Spanish. I lived in Mexico for 5 years. I've had many interactions in Spanish with many people in Mondragon and many people in Cuba. And so my personal observation is that if we can establish a more cooperative society over time, it's not going to happen in our lifetimes, but over time, that human nature can actually begin to shift. We do have a large number of ego-focused individuals, and we have alpha egos that are controlling our country. But if we can begin to create new cooperative institutions, I believe we can actually change the direction of our economic, political, and social system. So I want to talk to you finally about the strategies that came out of the United States Social Forum. Number one, it is important to continue to struggle to meet the needs of people inside our existing society. I know that Scott Myers-Lipton was, did he come? He hasn't come yet? No? Okay. So I know he was intending to speak here about a month ago because I was here. And Human Agenda has been working on that issue of modernizing the business tax in the city of San Jose. 3 days ago, I was at a city council meeting with Scott Myers-Lipton. And while the campaign may be suspended, it did have a positive effect. What's very likely is that the city of San Jose will increase its business tax by itself. In other words, Sam Liccardo has put out a proposal to increase the business tax by $13 million a year. So even if the Modernize the Business Tax local measure does not go on the ballot in June or November, it still paid dividends to begin that campaign, because the people of San Jose will have an additional $13 million from large corporations only in Silicon Valley, and be able to use that money to fill potholes, to put water on fire trucks, because fire trucks no longer carry water and homes are burning down, like on Alsodais last week. It will improve the security of the people of San Jose, because right now the police really don't respond to burglaries, for example. They don't have enough people. The police force has been depleted from 1,400 to 900, and they simply don't have the bandwidth to be police. To do the things that would make us feel a lot safer. So that's one example of working to make reforms inside our existing economy, and that's really important. You never want to abandon people in the middle of their struggles, and people are struggling every day for food, for housing, for immigration reform, for labor rights, for minimum wage. I had a woman come to my office this week. She gets $9 an hour in the city of San Jose and works $14 an hour and gets $9 for each one of those 14 hours. So she does not get minimum wage under the city of San Jose's minimum wage ordinance, and she does not get overtime. And so you want to support people that are struggling inside our current society, because we need them to be allies in trying to create a better society. But it's not only because we need them as allies, we need them to get minimum wage. We need them to get health care. We need them to eat. We need them to have a house over their head. These are critical to every human being. So the second area is, it really is important to have a clear vision. When I say clear, I mean care work, labor, education, autonomous decision making, and realization. A vision that really meets the needs of human beings. And it needs to be on values, based upon values of democracy, equality, cooperation, kindness, and sustainability. And with that vision, then, we really need to do the very hard and difficult work of creating alternative institutions. If we have another crisis in 2008, like we had in 2008, or if we have another recession like we had in 1929, and there's absolutely nothing to put in its place, what are the options? To continue the old. And as long as we continue the old, we're going to continue to have to operate under institutions that really do not meet the values that we care about. So we need to do the work of creating cooperatives, of creating public banks, of pushing to create more commons, public commons. And if there is the opportunity to actually nationalize an auto industry again, then we need to take that opportunity. A fourth area is to really democratize political power. And I've already mentioned the importance of that. In Human Agenda, we're working for the Voters' Right to Know initiative. We're working to also get Prop 49 back on the ballot in November. And we're also working in different ways to support Bernie Sanders and his campaign. And finally, it's really important that we really work on ourselves, because without personal transformation, we're not going to be able to really work on these areas that can transform society and help a lot of people, including ourselves. If we have a vision and we try to actually live a personal life based upon values of democracy, equality, cooperation, kindness, and sustainability, we will, each one of us, make a huge difference. And so that is the challenge. The last thing I'd like to mention is that Human Agenda is involved in what's called the Next System Project. There is a national project. Actually, Gar Operowitz is one of the co-chairs, and Gus Speth, who spoke here at the ENSA a couple of years ago, is the other co-chair. And there are a group of primarily intellectuals and academics looking at what would a new economic, political, and social system look like in the United States of America, focused primarily on the economy, but still, I think, a very important project. And we're going to be having teach-ins at the ENSA on April 26th, at San Jose State on April 27th, and a community teach-in on May 7th. And I'll be forwarding you that information. I think it's important to continue the dialogue. And at this point, I would like to engage in dialogue. So thank you for your time, and I'd be glad to hear any questions that you may have.
Wow. Okay. We have a way of handling the questions for you. So we will bring the mic around. Remember, hold the mic like this so we can record it. That's close to your mouth, not like this. Right. Okay. And I will keep track of who puts up their hands, and then I will go over there. If you are actually talking, you should have the mic in your hand.
Yes, very good presentation. One of the things it seems like you left out was reproductive rights, and that's according to what you mentioned, all the environmental problems, those are all essentially overpopulation problems. And, the low-hanging fruit for controlling population is, universal access to abortion services. And on a similar thing, in order to make up for the workforce that we're not going to have as far as descendants, if we do get population under control, we need to inspire technological development. And, here you mentioned the wage inequality in this area, being 400 to 1. And the gap isn't because, we're oppressing poor people here. The poor people in this area are richer than poor people in most other areas. It's just the people who develop all the cool technology are extraordinarily rich. And I wonder if we would have that if we didn't let, some of these people get extraordinarily rich in order to invent Google and smartphones and all the cool stuff that help poor people.
I hear a number of questions there. Yeah. No, in terms of reproductive rights, it's absolutely having universal access to abortion, etc. clinics is critical. In terms of the obscene wealth that's going on in Silicon Valley and around the world, I don't believe that we need that 400-to-1 ratio in order for people to feel good about their jobs. I think if a software engineer earns $200,000 or $300,000, they don't need to be, which is what we have going on in Silicon Valley, CEOs that are making 400 times the janitor, for example. It's just obscene. I don't know if all of you have seen the latest Oxfam International report. We now have 62 individuals on planet Earth that have the same amount of wealth as the lower half of humanity. The same amount of wealth as 3.5 billion people. And some of them are exactly the CEOs of software companies, including Bill Gates is number one still in the world. And that amount of amassed wealth only comes from exploitation, exploiting people, and monopoly rights, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I understand the importance of innovation. However, there have been plenty of examples on planet Earth where innovation has gone rewarded enough financially, and certainly the rewards of doing something for humanity also, people accept that as a reward also, without really needing to receive the grotesque amount of wealth that people receive in this valley and some multi-billionaires receive, like the Koch brothers in other places. That's my opinion. Any other question?
Arthur Jackson here. An issue that has troubled me for a long time is the feeling, why would a person take drugs in order to feel good about themselves or about being alive? And it seemed to me that underneath that is a feeling, a lack of purpose, a lack of not being able to use one's life in a personally satisfying way, and taking the answer that, well, I hear that if you take this stuff, you'll really feel great. Does anything you say relate to that? If not, just go on.
Absolutely. I think that people who resort to drugs are very alienated from themselves, from their community, sometimes from their spouse. And it's the people who find a sense of purpose and are engaging in human activities that are rewarding that don't resort to drugs, in my opinion. I saw a lot of drug use in my own family. My father was an alcoholic, and he actually committed suicide in a head-on auto crash that was premeditated because he took out double indemnity life insurance 2 days before he died. My mother tried to commit suicide 10 times. She was a nurse during World War II, and she finally did. And she not only was an alcohol addict, but also a drug addict. As a nurse, she had access to drugs. Both of my parents were extremely alienated, in my opinion. I grew up in a very alienating household. And so I'm very familiar with drug use, and not just from a personal family perspective, but from working with a lot of people over a long time. I think all of us have known a lot of people with drug problems. And we always have to ask the question, well, why can't you just take that next step? A lot of times people are not given the opportunities to meet their basic human needs. And we have to create those opportunities to let them feel that they do have purpose in life. A lot of times people just feel closed off from, being able to access important areas of their life. And it's true. And I think we as a society have a responsibility of creating access to meaningful areas of life.
Thank you for your talk and for all that you are doing. And I have a question about cooperatives. So cooperatives are great in many respects, But what about the economic competitiveness? So we know some very successful, like Winco, for example, employee-owned corporation, which is very successful. But we know that Israel, for instance, is a country with like socialist upbringing, and they have from the beginning the cooperatives that they called kibbutz, that are still there, they exist, but they cannot be economically competitive without some support from the government. And so is it something like the inherent weakness of this form of organization, or is it something that can be overcome over time? So what are your thoughts?
It's a very good question. I have to say, because I've been to the Mondragon cooperatives in northern Spain a couple of times, the Mondragon cooperatives, it's a corporation of cooperatives, 280 cooperatives. They started in 1956 with Fagor, which was creating washing machines, and they've expanded now to have 280 cooperatives. And they are extremely competitive. I mean, they've grown from 5 people to about 130,000 people working in cooperatives that are competing in, they make more auto parts than any group of industries in all of Europe. So they are basically the auto parts producer for a lot of the large European car manufacturers. They have agricultural cooperatives. They have the second largest Walmart of Spain, a group of retail stores. And they have the third largest bank in Spain also. So it's one example that has been successful working inside of our capitalist economy. And they always, of course, living in the sea of capitalism, are subject to possible laws that would undermine the cooperatives. And that's exactly what happened in the United States in the 1880s and 1890s. In the United States, with the Knights of Labor, they were promoting cooperatives, and there were literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cooperatives in the United States that got shut down because the big railroad barons didn't want cooperatives to be competing with them. And so through a series of laws that were passed, cooperatives were smashed. And so there's always that dynamic going on of the large corporations trying to smash, cooperatives that are trying to get off their ground. However, the more that people understand the nature of cooperatives and the fact that they do create an alternative, I think allows support to be gained at the political level also. We always say that cooperatives are necessary but insufficient. Cooperatives alone cannot change the world. Cooperatives, as part of one aspect of a system, can be very helpful. Let me give you one example. Actually, I didn't really talk about it, but what would economic relations look like, for example, in healthcare, if, as one example, if we had a transformation in the United States? Most people that I run with would like to see Medicare for all, that we basically have opportunity for everyone to have their healthcare needs met. However, does that mean necessarily that we would want a large multinational corporation to be making stethoscopes? No, I'd rather a cooperative be making stethoscopes, personally. Does that mean that we as individuals will have our healthcare needs met if we have healthcare for all, and if, for example, a lot of the products and services are carried out in a more cooperative and democratic and egalitarian manner? No, because there's that little thing called individual responsibility. It doesn't matter what system we have in place, if we're not going to take individual responsibility for our own health, then we're not going to be healthy. If we don't eat right, if we don't exercise right, we're not going to be healthy. So it's a composite of answers. And I would like basically to say that every need that I've talked about really requires that we look at, first of all, who owns the housing, the corporation, the land, etc. Ownership is really a critical issue for looking at any human need. Secondly, I think it is really important to look at these values. Are these human needs met by institutions that are democratic, egalitarian, cooperative, kind, and sustainable? And then third is our own individual responsibility. When Gandhi was asked the question, what's more important, social rights or individual responsibility? Gandhi said, individual responsibility. How do you get social rights without individual responsibility? And so I don't stray away from that quote-unquote personal responsibility mantra of the Republican Party. I think we have to be responsible individually, and we need conscious humanist activity, conscious humanist activity, conscious humane activity. Cha-cha-cha is what I call it. And if we don't do that as individuals, we can't create the institutions and hold them accountable that we need. So I hope that answers a little bit. But yes, cooperatives can exist and do exist. And in fact, in the former Yugoslavia, over 50% of the GNP was produced by cooperatives until the United States decided that the former Yugoslavia would not be a place where corporations could function openly. Next question.
Okay.
This is going to be the last question, so.
Well, I do think the gentleman up front does make a pretty valid point. I mean, I'll be in Cuba in a couple of weeks, and I want to look at what they're doing those things. But clearly that hasn't changed the landscape of a land which there's a lot of poverty and there's a lot of difficulty of realizing potential.
Right.
My question relates also to what you just said. I think a very interesting statistic about 30% of people are actually willing to work together and cooperate and look at that. But that tells you that there's a large percentage of people who, that's an issue. And I think one of the big issues, especially if you look at this at a global scale, is, people's desire for power and and in general people's sense of materialism, always wanting more.
Right.
When they have something, wanting more of whatever that is. And I see those as huge barriers to, accomplishing these kind of issues. And those go back to our DNA, really. I mean, they've been evident in all of recorded history. And it's very difficult to see how that becomes something that is a learned behavior as opposed to an instinctive behavior, at least among certain people. So I wonder how you rationalize that, how you deal with that in what you're doing.
Well, certainly we need to transform people's mindset to talk about conscious consumption as opposed to overconsumption, which is what a lot of people, we are trained 600 to 1,000 ads per day to consume, consume, consume. We live in an economy. When Paul Sweezy wrote his book on monopoly capital way back when, he has a chapter called The Sales Effort. And so we are brainwashed, every single person in the United States of America, that the value of our being is the value of our consumption, how much we control in terms of our economic interests. And so it's very difficult to reverse that because we don't have that level of propaganda to say that, no, we don't need to overconsume, we need to consume enough. However, as you know, there are many indigenous groups in the United States that think about 7 generations and not 1 generation, or not even their immediate needs. But rather, how do we create a society that looks towards the future and doesn't look at the now consumption that we live in today in the United States of America? It requires a complete ideological transformation than compared to what we have today. I did want to just mention one thing because you are going to Cuba. The Cuban government has decided to lend the land and the basic infrastructure in order to create cooperatives. And cooperatives are now earning anywhere from 4 to 10 times as much as they were making before they worked for the government. So the Cuban government is actually taking 1 million people that were employed by the government and saying, we want you to create small businesses or cooperatives. And we're no longer going to support you in these government jobs, many of which have become obsolete because the technology became obsolete many years ago because it was Soviet technology. But this is this is an actual policy change in the Cuban government in order to try to raise the living standard, and I believe also make the economic institutions in Cuba much more democratic. You rarely see that from a government, but I think the government is doing the right thing in Cuba to make that transition to cooperatives, to increasing the wages of Cubans, and to make their workplaces more democratic, egalitarian, cooperative, kind, and sustainable. That's what I saw when I went to Cuba last year. So we can continue the conversation at the table. Thank you.